hello. Yes,
Professor Sir Gillian Prance is a Fellow of the Royal Society and much else besides.
Well, thank you very much for
He is a distinctive as well as a distinguished head of the world's largest, most influential and possibly best known botanical gardens at Kew. Like the famous gardens, there is much more to the current director than at first meets the eye. Even his Scottish name is unusual, with a story behind it.
My mother's Scottish heritage was extremely important to her, and in fact she took my father for their honeymoon to the Isle of Skye, and they got lost in the Cuillin Mountains on a mountain called Scuana Gillian, and that is why their first son was called Gillian. So I have that Gaelic name Gillian that means Gilly Ian, the disciple of John.
Ian, as he is more familiarly called, in fact grew up in Skye during the war years. His father, a retired colonial civil servant, moved the family north in order to command the island's home guard. Ian was just 3. They stayed with his mother's relatives at Dunvegan House, not far from Dunvegan Castle.
One of the nice things about living in Dunvegan is that even in the wartime, when a lot was going on in the rest of the country, it was very quiet and peaceful, and I was able to wander out onto the moors and the hills around, into the garden and other places down to the loch. And so it was quite natural, I think, that I became interested in all the natural history around me, whether it was the animals, the birds or the plants. And I know that my love of nature began during those years in the Isle of Skye. My mother used to take us out quite often in a rowing boat on the loch, and one of the things I remember most clearly is that she used to sing, and the seals came up and popped up and listened, and she sang Gaelic songs, and so my mother was very keen on the Highland music. I loved it too and still do, and it arouses me every time I hear some of those Gaelic songs or the bagpipes. We moved just before the end of the war to a place called Toddington in Gloucestershire. My parents bought a nice house that looked straight over from the edge of the Cotswolds to the Morven Hills, and it also had 50 acres of woodland around it. So again, it was the ideal place for a budding naturalist. There was not another house for a quarter of a mile away from that house, and with all the fields, the orchards, the woodlands, I had all that to learn a great deal more about nature around me. One of the things that helped me best at the time when we moved back to England was that my father's sisters started visiting, and 2 of them in particular were very keen amateur botanists, Aunt Gertrude and Aunt Hilda, and both of them had the original flower books by Bentham and Hooker produced at Kew, and they taught me to use them. They taught me to learn the plants by their Latin names and not just by their common names, and so I think they turned me much more from general natural history, birds and animals, to plants, and were very influential on my future decision to be a botanist.
Ian and his 2 sisters, Aideen and Christine, settled happily into this English country idyll. But tragedy swept suddenly down upon the family. Ian's father contracted lung cancer and died after a year-long illness. It was a terrible time for them all.
After my father died, I wandered out much more on my own into the fields to observe the birds, to collect flowers and this sort of thing. And it probably strengthened me as a naturalist a great deal without my realizing it. It was my solace in many ways.
Left to himself, he also began to read, and what he read gave him the idea of ordering his interest, the basis for a scientific rather than just an enthusiastic approach. One book was Gilbert White's A Natural History of Selborne.
There was an old battered copy of a late 19th century edition of the Natural History of Selborne that belonged to my grandfather that was on the bookcases that lined the dining room in Shetcombe House. I picked it up and started reading it. And what fascinated me was that here were things recorded that were just like the things I was seeing going on around me. Some of them I had already observed myself in Toddington or in Skye, other things that I had never seen, so it started me looking for those. And it was just a book that stimulated my curiosity and to see that someone else was making those sort of notes. Well, I think that probably more than any other book in natural history, that is a book that influenced me the most.
At 12, Ian was sent away to school, to the town whose hills fringed the western skyline from his home in Toddington, Malvern College, Worcestershire. In number 1 house, his housemaster, Bill Wilson, was a keen botanist.
He was a bachelor at that time, so he had plenty of time on the school holidays to take us off all over the country looking for plants, or in the case of one of the others, collecting butterflies. And we had a wonderful time. We would go off in the car to some remote part looking for whatever we were after. We always had planned what we were going to see. Sometimes it was his idea of where we would go, sometimes it was mine. And so we really went all over southern England looking for one plant after another.
His emerging gift, his evident passion for plants, and his housemaster's enthusiastic recommendation took him to Oxford and a botany degree course. But for Ian, university proved life-changing in a wholly unexpected way.
When I arrived in Oxford, I was absolutely thrilled to be doing what I'd wanted to do, to be studying botany. And one of the interesting things was that some friends from the Christian Union came and visited me and invited me to go along to the meetings, first of all to a freshman's tea, and later on the Sunday evening to go to the service in the university church. And I went along several Sundays and got more and more interested in that. And on my 3rd Sunday at Oxford University, I made a very definite commitment to Christ, and that's when my life changed radically. It was the first time I'd really heard the gospel of Christ preached in a clear and rational form, and also with a considerable intellectual approach. I think that what I had heard before was very, very plain and dull preaching in local parish churches, and then not very helpful on the whole preaching in college chapel at school, and very often more putting you off than encouraging you towards faith. But by being taken to the right place where the gospel was clearly expounded by leading intellectual preachers. The Reverend John Collins was actually the person who preached the sermon where I went forward and committed my life to Christ. And I felt a great sense of forgiveness, and that this was going to be something important for the rest of my life.
Encouraged to share his new faith, he took part in a Christian beach mission that summer to holidaymakers at Frinton-on-Sea in Essex. Once more he came face to face with the unexpected. Anne Hay was the daughter of a Norwich clergyman also on the mission. They fell in love, and it was not long before they were engaged to marry. Ian's future father-in-law was in a good position to advise him on his choice of a godly vocation.
He talked to me a lot about this, and he said, well, you've got a great gift in botany, you know so much about it, you should maybe that's a talent that the Lord's given you, you should not give that up lightly. Why else have you had all this experience so early? And he really made me see that that is a vocation too, and that there's a great deal you can do as a layman for the Lord.
By then, Anne had embarked on an English degree in London, so the couple delayed their wedding for 3 years. They were married on the 13th of July, 1961, his sisters as bridesmaids. Not long after, Ian graduated from Oxford, where he had in the end stuck with botany. He had chosen, though, to specialise in the then rather unfashionable discipline of taxonomy, the science of plant identification and classification. For him today, still a very personal enthusiasm.
I was interested in taxonomy from a child, in separating different plants, in identifying them. And so I think my childhood influence, my aunt's amateur interest in taxonomy made that the logical field for me. And then as a teenager going out with Bill Wilson, I was interested in the plant hunting aspect. And I think I always wanted to make my career something of the exploration and plant hunting part of botany. And so it was quite logical that I would want to get my career much more on that way than in squashing plant cells and looking at their chromosomes. But one thing I do feel is that the world doesn't realize that plant taxonomy is such a basic thing to botany. None of the other areas of biology could really perform well if they couldn't identify the organisms that they're using.
His plant hunting adventures in the field had started even while at Oxford, co-leading a plant collecting expedition to Turkey. It was a revealing time. He found he loved expedition life and discovering new plants. God, too, seemed to offer him new revelations. He often remembers climbing Ak Dalglari, the White Mountains of the Lycian Taurus range.
We walked up a very long walk through the cedar forest and then above the tree level and got up into this area where it really was white because it was very pale rock that the mountain is made out of. And you look down across the whole plains and further along the mountains. And I think that was the most beautiful scene I had ever seen in my life. And definitely there I saw the wonders of God's creation, and it was a true mountaintop experience for me spiritually as well as physically, and it made me think about some of the mountaintop experiences in the Bible, and it's something I have never forgotten. In fact, I broke out in praise of God on top of that mountain.
It was much nearer sea level that Ian was to spend most of his expeditionary life. On graduation, he accepted an invitation from the New York Botanical Garden to join an expedition to South America. There he found a botanical challenge to match his great talent, one which would consume most of his subsequent field career, the flora of the Amazon basin. On his return, he moved his young family to New York and within weeks set off again south for the rivers of the rainforest. Anne was not amused.
Well, when Ian left for his second expedition, it was a bit of a shock, really. He'd always said that he wasn't going to do expeditions after we were married, and then he wasn't going to do expeditions after we had children, and here I was with a child in an unknown place, far from family and friends, and there I was, marooned.
I've always got the adventure and the new things happening, and once I'm out there I'm so absorbed in what I'm doing that it really is not hard on me, but it certainly was hard on Anne.
When he came back from that expedition, the experience had been lonely enough and difficult enough that I thought we absolutely weren't going to do this again, and so even if we could only eat very poorly for a few months, we would save every penny and we would go as a family the next time. And that's what we did ultimately.
But if North America had felt a foreign culture to Anne, Brazil and the Amazon was doubly so.
Moving into Manaus was extremely difficult. Every drop of water, of course, had to be boiled. And that was that doesn't sound like very much until you start doing it. And with a tiny baby who was actually bottle fed, just getting the water boiled, cooled, and ready to drink was a major problem. So I think I remember most the physical difficulties. We moved into a flat. Well, not really a flat. It was a horrible, horrible room that I called Cockroach Hall because it had enormous cockroaches in. And we were on the 10th floor of a building which had a sporadic lift, would be the best thing to call it. And so I had one child of 10 weeks and a child of 3. And they were both very, very fair-haired. And, of course, Brazilians were quite intrigued by these fair-haired children. And they would touch their hair for good luck. And so poor Rachel was always having her hair sort of pulled like this on the streets. And they would mutter over her because it was good luck. So there were all sorts of tiny things which physically became very difficult.
When Ian went off into the jungle, Anne was left in Manaus to cope on her own. Local missionaries were a great support. And there were other compensations.
My really special time was the very early mornings when I used to sit. I had a little round window in the room, and before the children woke, I used to sit up in this little tiny window, and I used to watch dawn happening. And there's the most extraordinary pre-dawn light over the Amazon, which is really pale green, and it's extremely beautiful and very peaceful. And from this 10th floor area, I could look down and I could see the river waking up and the town waking up below me. And you could hear in the very far distance the noise of the outboard motors coming. And it was as if they carried the keys to the morning, and it was so beautiful.
Splitting their time between New York, where Ian had found a research post in the Botanical Gardens, and the Amazon, they were soon asked to assist the faculty of INPA, the Amazonian Research Institute. Anne quickly became an expert in field logistics, somewhat to her cost.
Because you want to be helpful, or I wanted to be helpful to Ian, I realised it would be a great help if I collected together the equipment ready for the expeditions. And so I started buying in stuff and having it all ready when he came in, only to discover that his turnaround time got less and less each time. So instead of having him home for 3 weeks while he was collecting everything, I had him home for about 3 days in the end, because I was so efficient at putting together his expeditionary equipment.
Then came a pivotal moment in Ian's life. He had set up a degree course at INPA in Amazonian botany for Brazilian students.
In the first course that we taught at INPA, we had a very great emphasis on the environment. And so I invited a colleague of mine from the New York Botanical Garden, Robert Goodland, to come and teach the discipline of ecology. Now, he is an environmental impact specialist, so he's particularly interested in what is happening with the development of the Amazon region. So we took our field trip to the Trans-Amazon Highway that had just been started about 18 months before our course. He and I went with the whole group of students, and we were truly surprised by the magnitude of the devastation, and particularly because it was not really working. They had planned to bring in lots of migrants and to settle people from the poor northeast of Brazil along the Trans-Amazon Highway. And this colonization program plainly wasn't working, yet it was cutting down a great deal of the forest.
Ian and Robert immediately collaborated on a stinging scientific indictment of the whole operation. Published under the dramatic title Green Hell to Red Desert, it caused a storm in botanical circles and alerted an increasingly concerned wider public to what soon became called the rape of the rainforest. Until then, Ian had been little more than an earnest botanist. Now he was a committed conservationist.
One of the interesting things about getting into the environmental side of botany was that it put together very nicely my interest in the Christian faith and in my work, because it gave a very, very definite purpose. And I felt that God was very much behind this change, and I began to study the theology of creation and what the Bible said about this, and found that it says a great deal about this. And I think it really put the two things that were quite separate in my life, my faith and my botany, very much together, and made me a much more balanced and whole person. The Bible calls us to be stewards of creation, and as you read from Genesis to Revelation, you read bits about that. One of my favorite passages are the last few chapters of Job. When God wants to reveal himself to Job, he doesn't talk about repentance and this sort of thing, but he shows the wonders of creation. One of the best passages of natural history and observations of nature in those chapters, and God is showing that he's revealed himself to us not only through the Bible but through nature. When I started exploring the Amazon, the basis of where I went on expeditions was places that were unexplored botanically, where other botanists hadn't collected plants. And naturally, those are the sort of places where we were in tribal areas amongst the indigenous Indian peoples. And so very soon I found myself talking to the Indians and began to see their plant knowledge. And that really started me working in another discipline apart from plant taxonomy called ethnobotany, the study of plants and people. And I have now done quite considerable work on ethnobotany amongst 14 different tribes of Amazonian Indians. One of the things I hate is people who call my Indian friends primitive, because they are certainly not primitive at all. They have a different culture, and they have great knowledge. They know far more about plants than any professor that has taught me, and I've learnt far more about plants from Amazon Indians than any teacher at Oxford University. Their apprenticeship is enormous to acquire the knowledge that they have, and so I would be foolish to think of them as people who couldn't teach me. And I have enjoyed learning from many Indian mentors throughout my career. I do think that my interest in the indigenous peoples was enhanced by being a Christian, and I was very intrigued by their closeness to nature and by the way in which their beliefs led them to be protectors of nature. I began to study those aspects more deeply in the Bible and see that there is a wonderful theology of taking care of the earth in our scriptures, and that made me interested in telling the church how, if we are to present faith to those people, it must be one which encourages them to go on taking care of the environment. It's not just a case of converting them, but it's a case of retaining their closeness to nature, their love of nature, and their protection of nature.
Serra Pelada, incredibly once a mountain in the heart of the rainforest, today is laid waste by freelance miners obsessed by gold.
I have worked a lot amongst the Yanomami Indians in the northwest Amazon, and their territory in 1987 was invaded by 46,000 gold miners. And unfortunately, the gold miners are using a very primitive technique of separating the gold with mercury. And so mercury pollution is rife in all the rivers, which has brought disease and devastation to those people. So I think that the Brazilian government needs to address the gold rush with extreme urgency.
In the next 15 years, Ian walked many hundreds of miles on plant collecting expeditions, finding many new species and setting up conservation and research projects. He had his fair share of jungle adventures, capsizing in rapids, surviving after a plane crash, and enduring severe malaria far from medical help in the heart of the forest. Throughout, he was based at the New York Botanical Garden and was steadily promoted to Director of Research and finally Vice President, with 150 scientists responsible to him. After 24 years, it looked as though the New World had claimed him for good. But then, in 1 week, he received no fewer than 6 letters from friends suggesting he applied for the vacant post of Director of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew.
The day we arrived in Rio de Janeiro, as I hadn't seen any news, I went out and bought the Rio de Janeiro newspaper, and there was a picture of the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, and it looked as if the whole gardens had been flattened by the photograph, and it said this terrible hurricane had struck Kew, and I knew that 2 weeks later I was going for an interview to be director of that garden, so I wondered if there was any gardens left at all to direct at that time. And in fact 1,000 trees had been blown down at Kew, but that meant that over 9,000 were still standing, and by the time I did become director 8 months later, they had done a magnificent job of clearing the trees, and today you wouldn't even know there'd been a storm. It's recovered so well because of the good work of the staff, and because nature has this wonderful power of regeneration.
Old friends among the flora at Kew are the tropical Chrysobalanaceae, the subject of his doctoral thesis at Oxford, and on which he is the world expert, and the giant water lily, Victoria amazonica, which brings back memories both for Ian and Anne. The discovery of its incredible day and night pollination cycle was the result of a major Amazonian research project led by Ian in the early 70s.
The flowers are white. They're actually 11 degrees warmer inside than ambient temperature, and they emit a strong fruity perfume, and that attracts beetles to them. And then gradually, by the middle of the night, the flowers close up and trap those beetles inside. There are tissue inside called paracarpals that are full of starch and sugar, which is just what beetles like, so they eat that. And the next day, as darkness comes on, the flowers reopen, but by then they've changed colour to red, and they're scentless, and the temperature is the same as ambient temperature. And at that exact moment, they release the pollen, and the beetles come out, and they get all dusted with pollen, and they fly on. Well, because Victoria produces a flower every other day, they'll fly onto a different plant that's got a white flower that attracts them, and so that will cause cross-pollination.
Oh, Victoria amazonica, it's such a beautiful water lily, but my memories are rather strange about it, really. One of my major and most salient memories is the dreadful pile of smelly clothes that need to be washed afterwards, because he would be all night in this revolting, boggy, still water. And the clothes that he dropped off in the morning before he went to his lectures were just absolutely unbelievable. They were so dirty and so muddy. And then he would leave me a very large sack, it was a sort of great sack like this, absolutely full of the flowers of Victoria Amazonica, and my job was to cut them in half and count how many beetles were in each one. And of course, the wretched beetles, you know, when they were liberated, would go everywhere. We had them in our hair, we had them on the carpets, and on the curtains, we had them behind the books. And I was never really sure how accurate my counts were, you know.
In fact, behind almost every plant at Kew, there is a story of research and discovery. Kew is very much more than a garden. Behind the presentation, glass houses and historic royal vistas lies a thriving scientific and horticultural community dedicated to recording and conserving, propagating and researching the very basis of life on Earth. Echoes of this science are all around the gardens, here and in the Kew Satellite Garden at Wakehurst Place in Sussex. And the fruit of their labours, often literally, is displayed informatively to the many students of all ages who visit to wonder and to work. For education is a key element in conservation. For the value of knowing something about plants is not new. To Ian, Kew must now become a world focus for environmental concern.
One of the most important things today is to address the environmental crisis that we face. And an institution like Kew that is dealing with such a large part of the plants of the world and has contacts around the world can have a great influence for the good. And I feel that if we were not addressing the environmental crisis of today, we would be failing the world. So I have put a great emphasis on conservation in my work at Kew. And I think that is because of the seriousness I see of the environmental crisis. But I also believe that it is a fulfillment of my faith as a Christian in caring for the earth.
When we first came here, we'd been here a few months, and I went to see the vicar of the church we go to, and I said I was very troubled because I had always been active in any church that we'd been in, and I couldn't see any way that I could actually commit myself to anything, because every time I try to commit myself to anything here, you know, one of the Foreign Office guests arrive or something happens, so it just isn't possible. And so he just looked at me and he said, "But my dear, your ministry is at Kew and we shall be supporting you." And it was a wonderful revelation, because I suppose underneath that is what I felt. But I needed somebody to actually affirm it and to speak it out for me. And that was very helpful.
For Ian and Anne, the earth is very much the Lord's, to be held in trust for the Creator. Whoever comes to meet Ian at Kew leaves understanding that the director, scientist and Christian, takes his charge most seriously, as one given in a spiritual as well as a national sense, by royal command.
There are many people that still believe that science and faith in God don't go together. There are obviously some scientists who are absolutely skeptical about Christian faith. But what is surprising is the number of scientists that there are who have a strong Christian belief. And talking to them, I found that their experience is exactly the same. One of the things that really confirms my faith the most is looking at the minute details of the wonderful interactions there are, like the pollination of the water lily, or the way in which bees lift open a lid and pollinate the Brazil nut. And I never cease to marvel at the various contrivances by which plants manage to get their pollen transferred from one to another. Now, I feel that there must be a great designer behind all this, and this confirms my faith more than anything.